I'm sorry my voice, I've got a cold, but we'll power through. Hope some of you, I know some of you I saw in the presentation today at noon, Katie LeGrand, the athletic director for compliance here at Villanova. Very interesting. I thought she was terrific in terms of giving us another side to sports law, sports intercollegiate athletics. She's kind of the police of recruiting violations and all those kind of things, which, as I asked her in the presentation, does she feel like, you know, coaches see her coming and they feel like here comes the police, here comes the judge. And it's a real role you've got to kind of straddle as an athletic director in compliance. She was very instructive in terms of here at Villanova we have 600 student athletes. They have a staff of 4 full-time, which seems incredibly small when you talk about that kind of 24 sports, 600 athletes. And imagine all the things you're dealing with donors, with boosters, with parents, etc. Obviously, a bulk of their work is taken up by 15 of those athletes with basketball, men's basketball. But we just hired a guy who came over from Rutgers. He's got more of a legislative background, Capitol Hill. Malcolm Grace, he's running he's doing only football and basketball compliance. So that was a godsend for her to take that off her plate. So now she's really handling the other 22 sports, which is no small matter. It's interesting because afterwards I asked her sort of which of the sports that give you the most work, most time beyond football and basketball, and she said, well, it seems to be men's and women's soccer these days, where most of the things are coming up, and then of course track, which has the most athletes, which I was shocked, even more than football, because you have fall track, winter track, spring track, you have all kinds of cross-country involved with that. You have throwers, you have distance, you have sprinters. So it was an interesting conversation, and what's interesting is that we are in a time of regulation where people that have done things a certain way for a long time aren't too keen with it. She mentioned we've taken on a new coach from a big-time program, and he is not down with all the regulations that we have at Villanova compared to where he was. So that's always a challenge when you have people come in from programs that are used to getting what they want. So I just look at athletic director. Obviously Vince Nicastro is going to teach a whole class on intercollegiate athletics, but my constant response when I talk to athletic directors is you really are like managing a whole business. With 24 leaders, as you will, in our case 24 coaches that are the leaders, and then again think about it, 600 athletes with each having their own world around them. Now most of those kids don't have big problems that have to be dealt with by compliance, but they might. And you just got to deal with all those. You got to look out for the institution. That's your number one goal. You don't want us to get caught. You don't want us to get in trouble. You don't want Villanova's name to be stained the way it's happened with some other big universities. And of course the FBI inquiry into Louisville and other schools has really rocked the whole world, where they're now doing a lot of self-scouting, self-inquiry, questionnaires to all men's football and basketball players about any potential problems we should know about are being filled out over the past few weeks, because they want to get in front of it. You're always better to be proactive than reactive, because when you're reactive, it's a problem. You're always responding to problems. So get ahead of it before they can. So I was very interested. I learned a lot, you know, not having a background in intercollegiate athletics, what they deal with, and it was interesting to see a lot. We had I think 6 first years, 1Ls in there that were Villanova student athletes. So that's always nice to see as well. Okay, so speaking of guests, we're going to have one in the latter part of this class as well. I wanted to give you guys a taste into what I think is probably the most growing area in sports law, sports business, sports jobs, which is analytics. It has become the rage in all sports. Used to be just baseball, but now it's certainly basketball, and jumping into hockey and football and other sports. Soccer is the specialty of this gentleman who's coming. Brett Myers is been tapped by MLS to really delve into all the analytical issues league-wide. And I think as well, a couple teams have contracted him to get into all the analytics for players. And again, he'll talk about it, but analytics in the simplest sense to me is taking the emotion out of decision-making in sports, taking your gut feel out of it, putting it into the statistic quantitative analysis where you know exactly what you should do. And you could apply it to a baseball manager, a football coach, hockey coach, basketball coach, and that's just the coaching side. Then there's the scouting side. You know, I know teams, say football, they will not take a running back at under 190 pounds in the first 4 rounds. It's just their scouting has shown that you do not do that, that there has been failures more often than not when you do that. Doesn't matter what you think of a certain player, you have to take the gut out of it, take the emotion out of it, and he'll talk about it from that. Now, that's his sort of moonlighting job. He's a Villanova Business School prof, his day job. So it's always good to have Brett Myers come over, talk about analytics. He'll be here around 4:15 or so, which will be a nice experience for us. Until then, I wanted to talk about a couple topics that continually come on the radar in sports. We'll get back to a labor issue, which I found interesting and students seem to, which is everyone thinks of labor as players, and that's really the primary force we talk about. But 2012 doesn't seem too long ago. You guys were whatever, in college, high school. We had a strike, not a strike, we had a lockout. Not of players, but of referees. We had a referees' labor dispute in the NFL where the NFL did exactly what I talked about, what they did with players. They replaced them. We had replacement referees in real games. Real games. And we'll delve into that in a quick presentation I'll give you about the referees' strike, which I think is another way of looking at collective bargaining in a different light, where in this one, it really wasn't about the money so much. It was about other issues. We talked so often about money and free agency and salary caps and things like that. This was much different in a way where you look at a strike, lockout in the terms of more basic issues. And we sort of take the black and white stripes off these guys and put them in the role of negotiators and bargainers for their behalf, and it becomes a much different look. So we'll talk about that. The first thing I want to talk about, however, is something that's become very personal to me in the past month, because we're going to talk about the concussion litigation that has recently settled thousands and thousands of players. Now, I have talked about concussions, I've written about concussions, I speak about concussions, but as I mentioned personally, I'm experiencing it now as a parent. My son is dealing with a concussion. It's tough. It's a tough situation watching him go through this. With limited ability to look at devices, sitting in a dark room a lot, not having much energy. And he got it in soccer, not football, but this is an issue that I'm seeing from a much different light as now dealing with it as a parent. With a child with concussion. So these are the kind of things where sometimes you teach and you think of it from an academic point of view and a human point of view, even looking at some of the older players having dementia, but then it becomes your kid and like, wow, this is a serious thing. And it's much more than football, obviously. She was telling me today, Katie LeGrand, about some of the concussion issues they're having in women's soccer and women's lacrosse that have been very serious this year. So when we think of concussions, we think of football primarily, but here's the thing, it's everywhere, it's around us, and it's a brain injury. Just like if you have a knee or leg or arm or shoulder, it's an injury that needs rehab, and the rehab is not as, frankly, as, what's the word, as facile as rehabbing a shoulder or an ankle, because it requires shutting down. And brain's a hard thing to shut down. It really is. So my son, Max, is now, as we speak, he's at a rehab center doing the whatever testing they have, where they have to have him follow light and things like that. But it's a haul, it's a slog. Okay, so the NFL had concussion litigation, which was, as I said, thousands of former players. And, you know, the reaction you get from a lot of people is, why are they suing? Because don't people know that when you play that sport, primary feature of it is banging your head against another person's head? That's what you do. But as our student will tell us, it was much more than kind of knowing that. It was a case against the National Football League for negligence, fraud, those kind of elements, which are much more sinister than saying, yeah, you should realize you're going to get knocked around, which is going to cause some future injury. Okay, so who's leading? Pat?
Yeah, so the case derived out of like the NFL's role in kind of trying to bury and hide the impact that they knew that would be or could be associated with concussions. And there was a pretty good case to be made that the NFL knew that this damage could result, but that it hadn't revealed that to the players. So starting back in 2011, players started filing lawsuits against the NFL and also the company Riddle, which makes helmets.
Riddell, yeah.
Yeah, and they alleged that they had breached their duties to the players by failing to take reasonable actions to protect players from the chronic risks created by concussive and subconcussive head injuries. At the time, there have been more than 4,500 players that had filed lawsuits like that. So the case that I had, in a class action, they had to propose a settlement to be approved by the judge, who had to also approve that the class was valid.
Right.
This was the issue determining whether or not that would go through the first settlement. They had proposed a couple different classes of players that would be eligible, including retired players who had kind of like legal guardians or other family members that could bring the suit on their behalf, as well as two subclasses that had either had a qualified diagnosis or not, which would range from something like dementia to ALS, Alzheimer's, or death with CTE. They had also had a couple different pay grades and different areas where the funds would go to, including education, screening for future health problems, and then the ultimate treatment, which was, I think, like $675 million, the bulk of it. Now, the parties had agreed to the settlement, but the judge was not on board with them, with the main concern being that the settlement just wasn't fair enough, and that the big problem in class actions is that once they're done, they're over, and that any of these players who fell into the class itself and had chosen not to be part of it couldn't bring litigation in the future.
Right.
So at the time of this case, he wasn't satisfied that that there would be enough money to go around, basically.
Okay. Yeah, that's the one element of the case where the judge kind of revised the settlement. And there were so many iterations, as you said, that we just gave you that one to consider. Here's sort of the background legal defenses going on here. So what you have is players around the country filing lawsuits against the NFL in various jurisdictions. That's fine. What you need to know is it was all consolidated here in Philadelphia under the Eastern District of Pennsylvania, because a lot of the lawyers representing these players are here. In fact, one of them is a Villanova alum, Saul Weiss, who's one of the lead co-counsels. And so they got the case moved here, and everything came under the auspices of Judge Brody. The big issue, before we get to what the players are charging, the big issue is preemption. And preemption, you may learn about in other courses, that basically the players are preempted from suing the NFL, just exactly what we talk about with players and free agent and other cases, the CBA. Okay, there's a CBA for this. Same exact issue we've talked about the past 4 weeks. There's a CBS for this. CBA, there should not be any court case. So the immediate defense from the NFL was preemption, that they're making these claims in state law and federal law, but it's all CBA. So what do you mean CBA? Well, in our past cases, we talked about CBA covering things like draft and free agency and salary caps and money. Here, they're claiming CBA covers health and safety. Now, you go through this 400-page CBA, is there health and safety? Well, nothing. There's no page that says we cover the health and safety of the players. But intertwined in all of these sections of the collective bargaining agreement, it talks about players being football players. It talks about first-class physical condition. It talks about having a right to see a doctor. It have a right to a second opinion, right to a surgery outside of your team. So the league is saying this is health and safety. Concussions are health and safety. We should not be liable in court for something that's in the CBA. This is the preemption argument. And if this case ever went to trial, which it never did, this would be the big defense. Okay, so what is, so have it, like I said there, it's a CBA, and if they're going to file this case, they got to go through the grievance process, not a court case. And the NFL is saying this is a labor dispute. This is a collective bargaining. This is not for the courts. So again, NFL is saying preemption, CBA. Plaintiffs, which now are, as Pat said, 4,500 ex-players, are saying no preemption. This is not health and safety in your normal course of events. This is brain trauma that we did not think we would get when we signed up to play in football. Now again, you have to be an idiot to think something's not going to feel right with your head after banging it against someone for a long period of time. But what they're arguing is that's okay. But future issues was never properly given us in terms of notice. Okay, so the plaintiff's argument is we weren't told this could really cause dementia, cause forgetfulness, cause mood disorders, and depending on how far you drill this down, cause suicidal tendencies. Plaintiffs are arguing negligence. The NFL acted negligently in failing to safeguard the health and player. This is whether there's a duty to protect player well-being. Again, to this argument, preemption. But this is, the plaintiffs are saying bigger than preemption. This is negligence. What would negligence be here? Well, here's an example. A team doctor knew the guy was foggy and sent him out there anyway. A team doctor knew the guy was groggy and approved him playing. Now, through discovery and depositions, could the players have found something like that? I would think so. But as I said, it never went to trial. Another argument they made was fraud. There was a mild traumatic brain injury committee formed And according to the plaintiffs, what they did was just basically protect their sides and hand out brochures about you're not going to have long-term brain injury. Misrepresentation, fraud. Again, these are the legal theories of the case. Hold on, let me see. Okay. These are some of the settlement, some of the things coming out of the settlement. So before I get to these, here's what happened. They sue for fraud, they sue for negligence, they sue for misrepresentation. NFL argues preemption. As Pat said, they go to court, they come up with an initial settlement. Settlement's not approved by the judge. They go back and they work out a new settlement. In 2014, finally you have a settlement. And here's the settlement. $765 million to the plaintiff's class. That's the general thought. On the first proposed settlement, it had a cap of that number. The judge disapproved it with a cap, so there's no cap. But this is the number float around. It's not on the screen, but it's $765 million going to the class of plaintiffs. There's also $75 million monitoring fund where you can go for mental monitoring. Again, if you're a former player. And they can monitor you through later in life to see what changes are going on. There's a partnership with GE, $50 million towards concussion research. There's a new neck and spine committee. There's a concussion protocol that came out of this that you see now in all the games you watch. What happens when a player is advanced through a concussion? He's in what you hear concussion protocol, where he can't practice full time, and then when he's out, he can. Okay, but the settlement is really, the two primary numbers are $765 million for the overall settlement, $75 million for the medical monitoring fund. And here's how it works. You don't even need to show causation, right? You don't need to show, I got hit in this game and it's caused me this. No. What you do now, it's anyone who's played in the NFL can come with a doctor's report that you're suffering these kind of symptoms. And they match it up in a grid. This is how these class action settlements work. I didn't know this. Where it's like a grid. How many years did you play? What age did you retire? What are your symptoms? What are your issues? And you get an amount. And the biggest amount is a $5 million payment if you can show symptoms of the presence of ALS. If you played the requisite amount of time, that's the biggest payout. Or $4 million if you can show the presence of Alzheimer's disease. Or $3 million if you can show the presence of Parkinson's disease. Now, one disease that's not covered in this settlement is chronic traumatic encephalopathy. That has been the focus of so many years and so many studies right now, starting with Bennett Amalu, who was played by Will Smith in the movie Concussion, who came upon this disease in former football players. Those studies have been continued. Now Boston University has examined hundreds of brains. Most of them have the presence of CTE. Again, these are deceased brains. There is no living diagnosis of CTE. So when this settlement was fashioned, there was no way to have CTE covered without a living diagnosis. They didn't want to encourage, and as morbid as this sounds, they did not want to encourage suicide in order for families to get the benefit. So even at death, there is no benefit for CTE in this settlement. That has drawn a tremendous amount of criticism. People are saying that's like settling coal miners without having black lung disease in the settlement. But Alzheimer's is covered. Parkinson's is covered. ALS is covered. Dementia is covered. Mood disorders are covered. But what's not covered is CTE. Primary reason, no living diagnosis. I think there will be one day. CTE, in simplest terms, is a tau protein that's present in the brain that usually shows up in very advanced states of dementia and Alzheimer's. And it is showing up in these former football players. Now, when I say the vast majority of the studies at Boston University, it's a selective sample, right? The people donating their brains are having issues. The people that donate their brains for when they die to this bank in Boston have issues. They're hurting. So that's the selective sample. You don't have people that are healthy and having active lives saying, I want to donate my brain to study for CTE. No. But I've had him here, Chris Nowinski, the guy who runs the Concussion Legacy Center up in Boston, and it is stark when they show you pictures of these brains at very young ages, relatively, 40, 35. And then there was a kid at Penn, who committed suicide at age 21, a football player. He had tremendous, tremendous advance CTE, 21 years old. And the real problem with CTE is not the violent blow-up hits that you see on TV. It's really the subconcussive blows over a long period of time. The presence of CTE has been mostly found in linemen, offensive and defensive, that are constantly hitting each other, not at high speeds, but constant, repetitive subconcussive blows. That's the scary part of concussions. They're silent injuries. Unlike my son, who went down in a flash on a soccer field, these are developed over time and cause long-term damage. People that have continued contact. And this is concerning for a lot of sports, lacrosse, soccer, where you just have a repetitive contact with balls or heads that lasts over time. During this whole period that Pat talked about, 4 years leading up to the settlement, I'm kind of an independent voice. I'd get a lot of people calling me saying, I want to join these lawsuits. Do you think I should? And I would say to them, well, do you have symptoms? Are you foggy? And oftentimes they would say no, but I might one day. And I said, well, how do you feel about suing the NFL without symptoms? And usually I'd hear something very kind of vindictive. Like, well, they screwed me, I had a knee injury, whatever it was. I didn't play as long as I should have, blah, blah, blah. And I would say, listen, you have to have your own personal ethics on this. But you're putting your name on a lawsuit where you don't have symptoms. I'd hear a lot of that because it was in the news. Lawyers are signing up clients right and left. And I sat here one day, I was here, Brian Westbrook was here one day, and he did not decide to join that suit. But he had some friends that he played with at the Eagles. We met him here. They were intent on suing. They had no issues. But they thought they would down the road. Here's the problem, I'll get to you in a second. Here's the problem with the lawsuit, if it was going to go forward. Because players would be deposed. Players would be discovered. You'd sit with a lawyer, and the NFL would do this. They would say to the player this kind of question. How long did you play football? Say a guy says 15 years. How much of that was in the NFL? I don't know, 3 years, 4 years. So you're suing the NFL for 15 years of football, but you only played 3 years. Yeah. Okay, that doesn't go over well. Number two, what was your lifestyle like? Because the studies show issues later in life with head injury or with brain trauma involve a lot more than contact sports. They involve lifestyle. They involve alcohol. They involve drugs. They involve opioids. So then they would depose these people and ask them all those kind of questions. Were you a partier? Were you a drinker? Were you a womanizer? What'd you do? Then they would say, well, what else have you done? Where have you fallen? Did you slip on the ice? You have a bike accident? Did you bump into someone on the street really hard? What happened? So causation would have been a real issue if this went to trial. And think how many players would have to go through that kind of questioning about causation. So what I'm trying to say is, I heard a lot of criticism from people saying, why would they settle for less than $1 billion when the NFL makes $15 billion a year? NFL just throws it away, and they'll never be sued again. And the NFL has no admission of liability, zero. And I would answer, they settle because that's the best deal they can get, and this is a hard case. The other thing is the NFL would make this case go till 2020. They would never get in a courtroom for years. Years. So, and then people were dying. One of the named plaintiffs, Kevin Turner, suffered from ALS, used to play here. He passed away. So I understand why they settled. Now, then you settle, then you get in negotiations, and you have these lawyers negotiating against Jerry Jones and Robert Kraft and Jeffrey Lurie. I mean, they're no match. The lawyers wanted billions. They started at like $5 billion. They settled for less than $1 billion. Now there's all these fights about the lawyers. The lawyers were given $100 million off the top, not to be paid by the players, to be paid by the NFL. And now there are all these fights about how to break that up. Here in now fall of 2017, players are just starting to see the money. Just starting. It's taken so long to get these things resolved. This was settled in 2014. So imagine if your player suffering these 3 years, not being able to get any kind of payment. Concussions is always going to be an issue. People ask, well, could players sue now? Well, theoretically they could, but you can't walk a block, you can't read a sports article and not hear about concussions. So the idea that there's something being withheld by the NFL or withheld by anyone about concussions is not going to fly anymore. It's all out there. But brain injury is a serious thing, obviously. I think the NFL did well to settle. I think that we are going to continue to see these horrible stories about dementia of former football players, and it's going to be a PR problem, but it's not going to be a legal or a financial problem anymore. Think about what an incredible threat to the future of the NFL business they've resolved with this. That suit could have cost billions and billions of dollars. If the players had the wherewithal to stick with it for years and get the smoking guns in discovery about team doctors putting players in that were concussed. You hear these stories all the time, but they're just stories. And again, when you're in your 40s and you played football and you're having trouble remembering where your keys are, or you're having trouble finding what you came into the room for, Is that from football? Is that from the NFL? Is that from some other lifestyle issue? Is that from getting older? Is that from other injuries? I mean, those are the kind of things that are tough to prove. All right, any questions on this? Yeah.
Do you think the fact that it wasn't like cap is a big problem for the NFL? Because it seems like you said that ongoing issues that might pop up in 10 years, it's still under the settlement. I know.
Yeah, and I asked about that. They just don't see it getting over $1 billion because of the grid. Again, I don't know what the grid looks like, but the grid is, you know, you play this number of years in the NFL, you have this problem, that's going to fit in. And this is how a lot of these mesotheliomania, whatever it's called, a lot of these class actions work like that, which is unfair, I think, to the plaintiffs, certain plaintiffs, but as a whole, that's the way they do it because there's so many. The scope of the numbers that could potentially be part of this are 20,000. 20,000 former players right now. Yes, Ashley.
Yeah, so I'm just having trouble with like the causation part. And you talked a little bit about lifestyle, but even in terms of individual players' decisions, like when you have a trainer sending a player back into the game, a lot of the time I'm sure they're like, "How are you feeling?" And it's a competitor's instinct to be like, "No, I'm fine, no, I'm fine."
Right.
And I know from my own experience and other student athletes, it's like a curse word to say that you have a headache. Like
Right.
at any point in time, do you feel foggy? Do you have a headache? And I might have a splitting headache, but I'm like, "No, I'm fine." You know, playing in tomorrow's game is more important. So I'm wondering to what extent that occurs, and then, you know, years later when they've told the trainer they're fine and still playing, like to what extent is that even the NFL's fault at that point?
I think it's a great point. I mean, you've identified it. We all want to play where the default setting of players is to play, and concussions are a silent injury, which you can mask. Now, maybe you can't mask it at the point of acuteness, but you can mask it that you're ready to go. Those stories were very harmful to this case because a lot of those stories would come out where there'd be stories about players that masked their concussions in order to play. There'd be stories about players that intentionally flunked their baseline test at the start of the season so they'd appear. And I asked my son about, oh yeah, guys do that all the time in soccer. So I don't know how you deal with that. I think the culture has to change. And the question is it changing? Now, we see stars in the NFL like Roethlisberger and Luke Kuechly sit out for weeks. That's great. But they have job security. We don't hear about the lower level players or the players in other sports that aren't able to sit out for weeks and keep their job. So I think the culture's changing. I don't know. The athletes you described were certainly present 5, 10, 20 years ago. Is that getting better? I don't know. I think it's an athlete's mentality to want to play. They see concussions as a silent injury that they can mask. How do you change that culture? I mean, now we do all this concussion education, and players are still doing that. How do you change that? I mean, is it like drunk driving? Do you show pictures of people that are drooling at age 45? I mean, I don't know how you change that. Anyone else? No, I think that, you know, you have Obama talking about last year, if I had sons, I wouldn't let them play football. When something like that happens, you know, there you start talking about what people take it seriously. But I don't think we're going to have this whole idea of mothers not letting sons play football affect the future of the sport. It may affect a small segment of players that don't participate, but I don't think it'll have any effect on the popularity and future of the sport. I just think, you know, it's ingrained in our society. Yeah.
When a player goes into concussion protocol, are there any rules against cutting that player?
It's a good question. You have a normal injury, anything, you can't cut a player while he's injured, but you can when he gets better. unless there's guaranteed money. So you can always cut them, you have to pay them. So if you say you have a guy in the end of training camp that stinks in terms of making your roster and he has a concussion, you have to work out an injury settlement to cover the time that he would be out if he were to make the team. Yeah.
Has there been any like trickle down to like college? Like, trying to sue?
Yeah, there was an NCAA suit that's, I thought about assigning it. The NCAA suit was settled, but it was settled with a $75 million education fund. No players got money. Same issues, concealment, fraud, negligence. And again, it's no secret why everyone's suing the NFL. They have the deep pockets. There was a case of a player at Frostburg State in Maryland who died, and the school was held liable for, again an aggressive coach, an aggressive trainer. And that was a personal injury lawsuit. But I haven't heard anything like class action-wise. There's an NHL case. Someone talking about that? Can you give us a quick update on that?
On the class action or individual?
Class action.
So they filed suit not long after the heat of the NFL litigation. It started out with 10 individuals, former players, and then quickly grew to over 100 some players with 6 people representing the class. It's different from the NFL where the NHL is more defensive, claiming that they're not going to be settling, and they're going to be arguing it vigorously.
Right.
But at the same time, it's almost more favorable to the players because of the environment that they're playing in. That's basically promotes fighting, and in recent discovery, that's come out even more so with executive emails being discovered talking about how they are selling the fighting. And other things that aren't helping them, where they call anti-fighting individuals, call them things like tree huggers and Greenpeace pukes.
They're calling the people that want to stop fighting, or?
Yeah, they
Okay.
want to stop fighting. This is internal emails within the NHL.
Right.
So it's all not helping their case. At this point, they're not acknowledging that CT is related to all the concussions that have occurred, which is also different from the NFL because they at least acknowledge that and contributed money into research. NHL standpoint is basically that they had a committee researching concussions in 1997, which went to 2004, and that they were the first in Major League Sports to conduct this type of research for brain injuries, and that those results weren't directly linked to the injuries that players were enduring, but the players kind of responded by saying that those results weren't released in 2011. They were very vague. Currently, nothing concrete has been going. Judge Nelson has said that she wants it to go to trial by 2017 at some point, but as we know, that's coming to an end, so it's probably not going to actually happen. The NHL did file motions to dismiss, which were all denied. Basically, the basis of the suit is pretty identical to the NHL or the NFL.
Yeah, fraud and concealment and negligence. So where do we stand on that? We may go to
So
trial.
The process is still going on right now. Judge Nelson wants to go to trial this year, which isn't going to occur. The emails keep coming out that are continuing to hurt the NHL, but nothing firm as to where it's going regarding trial at this point.
Does anyone think that the fact that the NHL does have fighting and this kind of macho culture is going to make it harder for plaintiffs? Yeah, Pat.
Maybe not if they were to bring in the NFL and like their findings on CT, because you don't get the same repeated head contact in
Right.
the NHL, play-by-play, game-by-game, as you would in the NFL, and even fights not that long.
Casey.
I don't know, I also just like don't understand, because the player themselves are getting into that fight. It's not the NHL like mandating that they have to fight that person. So like, they're taking it upon themselves. Like, I don't know, I just feel like that with all the concussion stuff, like, you as an athlete at the end of the day, you're deciding to step on that field and play. And you know what the consequences are, whether it's concussion or another traumatic injury. Like, I don't know, I just don't, like, I think at the end of the day, it's on the athlete.
Well, I think NHL, you can say this, but it just seems like they, I sound like such a novice fan, but they let them fight, right? It's part of the game to let them fight until they go to the
whole culture thing.
until they go to the ground, right? That's like, you do that. Go ahead, fight.
There was discussion of the enforcers in the NHL.
Yeah.
Are there to fight, but that's been recognized as starting to vanish slightly, but not to the extent that people want.
Yeah.
I think it's been vanishing a lot, and I think the NHL has, excuse me, taken, I mean, it is kind of outrageous that they are just allowed to fight, but if you've just seen the evolution of the game over the past 5 years or even a decade, fighting is becoming increasingly more rare. I mean, it still does happen, and it still is a part of the game, but players like enforcers are not even close to as prominent as they used to be. Refs have been cutting down, not letting fights when ordinarily they would be.
You think that's in response to this lawsuit or just general societal culture changes?
I'm not sure. Sorry, what was the lawsuit? So it's ongoing? Yeah. I think it was just, in general, that I think it was more societal, I guess. And I think the big thing is they've taken out really hard hits that would, like, big open ice hits, like Scott Stevens hits, are not tolerated anymore, like, whatsoever. Like, you get severe penalties for it, and even just suspensions. I think the NHL has been taking steps. I'm not making a comment of whether they're not making bigger steps enough or not, but I think I've noticed.
Jack.
I'd just be a little curious as to the pay structure of defensemen in the NHL. Like if there's, I don't know, any kind of like relatively obvious, like, you know, solid defensemen, but guys that aren't enforcer type characters get paid significantly less, then that in and of itself would kind of encourage players to be more physical and fight more, or be more willing to throw their bodies in front of other players. So I wonder if that kind of silently forces players to be more aggressive and more macho. Because I think that definitely would have some standing.
There's been this thought about these goons, right?
Yeah.
So you're saying they're less goons?
Considerably.
Considerably, okay.
Like, there used to be, like, back, like, 20, 30 years ago, guys that could, like, barely skate like that. They were literally just on the ice. I mean, they could skate around, but they were there just to throw their bodies with them. They had, like, no...
And that was tolerated?
Yeah. And it's not anymore. Like, players like that, like goons, like, there still are much less skilled players that really are on there for their physical strength, but not to, like, throw their bodies and injure people in
Yeah.
places.
Any hockey players in here? You guys? You accept the risks?
Like, when I played.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A lot of head contact.
No, especially not like at the youth level, because it's just not tolerated. They have, like, in high school and at the youth level, way more severe penalty for like contact than they have is an actual penalty. With like steeper implications of not being able to play
Okay.
at that age. So I think, and like you might agree, at the lower level, there definitely is like a movement and efforts to like educate players on the dangers associated with that.
Yeah.
I mean, at least when I was playing, you weren't even allowed to check until you were a PE, which was old, like 12, 13.
Yeah.
So before then, that's just not even a part of the game.
Yeah, and I think I'll leave it there because that's probably the last thing I would say about this is that to me it's all about the youth. And grown-ups know the risk. That's what Ashley was talking about. We know what we're dealing with, but youth doesn't. And I just think that we as a society have to be more protective of youth with contact sports. And this is not what the NFL wants to hear, but I just think flag football has got to be the way to go until a certain age, whether that's 14, 15, whatever it is, because we are seeing data that says the more hits, the worse you're going to be off later. And why subject kids to these hits? I think this is really like, you know, Chris Nowinski says, you know, we don't have take your kids to work day for contact sports. We do for other jobs, but we do not subject kids to head trauma. And it's unfortunate that we still have youth programs that don't recognize that. Because to me, that it all starts in youth. Okay, so if you're a steel worker that works on the 38th floor, you understand the risk. If you're a coal miner, you understand the risk. If you're an airplane pilot, you understand the risk. If you're a football player who's an adult, you understand the risk. But kids don't. So we'd never have a kid be on a skyscraper doing steel work. But we have kids playing football. So this, to me, is where we have to sort of focus the attention in my mind. If adults want to take that risk, okay. And that's why when Tom Brady's wife goes on and says, yeah, he's had concussions, he hides them, whatever it is, I don't see it's a big deal. I get it. It's what Ashley was talking about. Happens at all levels. But that would have been a great time for Tom Brady to come and say, you know what, I do, but kids shouldn't do that. That would have been a huge opportunity. Instead, he kind of denied it or whatever, because that's the culture. And again, I'm speaking as someone who's got a kid going through it. But he's played soccer, and up till 8th grade, they wouldn't allow him, there was no heading. So there's a step. You know, in the youth leagues around here, there's no heading in middle school soccer because your necks are not considered strong enough to withstand those blows in middle school. I'm sure it has positive effects. Any questions? Okay, so I wanted to talk about this concussions. I'll get to the referees strike early part of next week, but I want to give us a break and come back with Brett. And for people who say it's going to go the way of boxing, where it seems like boxing was replaced, at least popularity-wise, by MMA, which is even more savage. They don't wear gloves. So I don't think football is going to go south for any reason due to violence. If it goes south, it's going to be all these other kinds of reasons. But these movies come out, these CTE studies come out, doesn't seem to affect popularity. Yeah.
Do you think looked into comparing like football to rugby in concussion ways, like to see if like, I don't know, they think they have like this helmet on so it protects them, like I've
Yeah.
really looked into comparing that?
Yeah, I don't know if they're advanced in rugby or even soccer to determine if similar rates of injury. Anyone know that? I mean, when I hear people talk about they should remove the face mask from the helmet because they think that would force people to not hit as hard, or remove or make it leather helmets, like the old days. What do you think, Khalil?
In terms of leather helmet?
No, in terms of the sport.
I was talking to the back of my mind, I always knew that their concussions could be a result of a lot of things I was doing. But really, the main thing for me was just getting the discipline and actually being in the team atmosphere. And that's what really got me into wanting to play the sport. And also, I was a very big guy, so we're like, might as well play football with that size, right? So I think it's one thing to also know, like when I was going into all this football stuff, it was like, well, you know, this whole thing with head-to-head collisions, you know that it's going to happen during football. Like, if you really don't want it to happen, why do you even play the sport? But it also gets to a point where you might know that you could get a concussion, but it's not as if you're really even thinking about that. You know, it's like, you know, it's unfortunate that that wide receiver went across the middle and got hit like that. Like, this is never going to happen to me. And then you end up meeting so many people that I've played with that a lot of times I wonder if, you know, down the road there'll be CTE repercussions for some of the hard hits they used to have. And you mentioned even, you know, some of the stuff that happens with centers and linemen. I mean, that stuff scares me too, being a center.
Mm-hmm.
For a team that ran a lot of power, scheme, a lot of hitting, in a physical offense, you know, what's going to happen 15, 20 years down the line. So it's just one of those situations where you absolutely love the sport, but you're just trying to figure out what's best.
Right. And like I said, when those guys used to ask me, should they join the lawsuit, I really empathize with the ones like you that just said, I just want to know what I can get years from now, what I'm going to be like. And that's the whole medical monitoring, which is a good part of the settlement, where you can go in, get you checked, and come back in a year, 10 years, 5 years, whatever. But the ones that got me upset were the ones that just wanted to get that last paycheck from the NFL. They didn't care about symptoms or not. Okay, any other comments about concussions before we move on? We move from concussions to analytics. I want to welcome a special guest from the business school, Mr. Analytics, I call him. Welcome, Brett Myers.
Absolutely. Well, good afternoon, everyone. A pleasure to walk across campus. I think I need to learn the most efficient route, though, because I certainly took it over here. And I think there's a few familiar faces. I think, maybe students that took me for MBA classes, so good to see you guys again. So, I mean, what's interesting, we talk about the journey, I talk about my journey. Everyone's got a different journey to ultimately where they are now. And I've heard, Professor Brandt, I don't know what you go with for your class.
Yeah.
I've heard his journey. It's a very, very interesting one. For me, I mean, maybe it just starts with just having a passion for the game. I grew up a very avid player, was one of those types that maybe subscribes to, I didn't know it at the time, but if you like the whole Malcolm Gladwell, 10,000 hours, I mean, I probably got there because I was just a junkie. I was a kid who was constantly in the backyard. I had a soccer goal there, regulation soccer. I was working on my striking, I was juggling, and just couldn't get enough soccer. Went on to play in college, went to University of Richmond. Back when they actually had a program, they don't have a program there anymore. I was very upset as an alumnus to see that.
Yeah.
Played 4 years, ended up playing professionally for the Richmond Kickers. It was a convenient option at the time. I was dating someone in college, so I could, establish that relationship and play pro soccer at the same time. Probably in hindsight, would have wanted to explore my options a bit more. After 2 years, kind of getting a taste for that scene, realizing that the paycheck wasn't great, my potential wasn't that great, not a good combination. That's when I went the academic route. So I did not foresee sort of getting back into the game in this capacity. I mean, it really wasn't until I ended up graduating with both a master's and PhD degree, ended up here at Villanova, had the freedom to do my first research paper where I wasn't tied into an advisor from college kind of pushing me in a direction. I wanted to do something I was passionate about. I had just read Moneyball. This was back in, I think this was 2010. So, I mean, Moneyball had been out for like 5 years.
Yeah.
I didn't read until 5 years later. And, I was inspired. I've always been one who was analytically oriented, quantitatively oriented. Math was my favorite subject growing up. I ended up, PhD in a quantitative field. I heard, reading Moneyball was, awakened to the role of statistics and how the Oakland A's were managed, the kinds of decisions that they made. I was after that book, reading articles, learning about forums and conferences that were sharing ideas, understanding that sports organizations were actually creating departments. And I thought about, I was like, okay, what type of cool soccer problem exists, or what could I do to talk about the game in that kind of way? And so I started thinking about my time on the bench as a pro. And when you're warming up in the second half and you're spending all that time running, and you're looking at the clock, you're looking at the game, and you're looking at the coach wondering, okay, is he going to put me in? And then he decides in the 91st minute of like 3 minutes of injury time, he's going to put you in. And the only silver lining there was I was thinking, okay, well, I get a bonus for appearing in this game. So that bonus is $100, and then I just made $100 in 2 minutes, so it's a pretty good hourly rate. That's the kind of math I was doing back then. But I was also wondering, and still wondering, years later, what exactly is going through the manager's head when he's thinking about that substitution decision. I think that there's a my hypothesis was there's a tendency to be a bit more reactive than proactive, and not necessarily to go in with a plan, but kind of see how the game goes, and then, if anything, a tendency to not want to pull the trigger on a subs and not to be aggressive, maybe where doing it earlier would be a better option. So I did a data mining study and discovered that there was some significance that when a team was behind, in general, those subs could get in earlier, that the odds of getting back into the game, drawing a game that was where you're behind, winning a game where it was tied, winning a game when you're behind, it was only when the score state was negative, that it basically could compile that into a decision rule. So I came up with specific times. So it was 58, 73, 79th minute. And I guess just the way in which I pieced together the argument, and thankfully for our media department in Villanova, the Wall Street Journal picked it up. And sort of once it got out there in the public space like that, then it opened up the door to conferences, speaking opportunities. Now, at first when I was getting all this interest, I thought that this could really lead to something cool. Well, the only thing tangible after a year was that a British pub in Wilmington, Delaware, invited me to come in, and they had a science night, and the article was called "The Science of Soccer Substitution." So like the British pub owner who was a big fan of soccer stumbled across this and said science and football and pub, and so I ended up there, and that was a lot of fun. I was wondering, we never talked about the terms, what the compensation would be for that.
Yeah.
But at the very end of it, after I presented, he said, thank you a lot. Anytime you want to come in here, fish and chips on the house, and hey, that's great. That was working for me. But it wasn't really until a couple years later, and like anything, it's always helpful to have a network and to know the right people. One of my former teammates actually went on a law school. He had a similar trajectory to me. He played 2 years of pro soccer. He realized that the same things that I was realizing, and he was a very, very bright guy. He ended up in law school at the University of Cincinnati. Ended up getting a job with a firm in Manhattan, really, really good job. And I think a year after that, a position opened up in the league office, in the Major League Soccer league office, competition department. So I don't know, I realize that Major League Soccer is not that popular, but you might be familiar with the single entity structure that they have. And when contracts are established, it's sort of 3 parties involved. It's club, it's agent, it's also league. And so he was in the department in the league that would help kind of broker these contracts and kind of oversee competition, regulations in the league, but also kind of working with agents and making sure that teams remain cap compliant, and that also advising teams on how to spend. So they could the league actually has some veto power. They feel like the club is overpaying for a player to step in. So anyway, my friend got all this experience. He was working in this department for years. So when this article came up and I was talking about, kind of had this idea about how teams in soccer should be using analytics more, he said, why don't you come to the league office and present to some of the other staff people and leaders, because ultimately these are the guys who help push this in the clubs that they work with. So I got that. I was lucky to get my foot in the door that way, and then one of the kind of higher up people in the league said, "This is great. How about you give the same presentation to the combine, to all the coaches and all the technical directors and front office people that tend to go." And I was like, "Whoa, that's crazy," but yeah, I'll take advantage of it. So once I did that, once I was in front of all the coaches, there were naturally some coaches that were kind of interested, and it made the most sense that the Philadelphia coach, with me being in Villanova and locally, to have a conversation. It also helped that he recruited me when I was back in college. He was the Wake Forest assistant. I was down to Wake in Richmond.
Oh, wow.
So he remembered me from a recruiting trip. So then again, it's like it solidifies that point of it's definitely more who do you know than what you know. So I ended up with the union. This was the 2013 season. I joined them. It was pro bono. Me basically just helping the head coach decipher through loads of data that he was paying a technology to do. He didn't have the time to sit there and break it down. The union was putting all the resources into the academy, not that many resources. If you're a union fan in the room, you probably know what I mean by that. So they didn't have the budget for this blown out department. They didn't have the budget even to hire one analyst, so they were going to get me for free. Pretty good deal. And so that was a lot of labor for not much compensation, and there's no compensation except for being able to go to the games, sit in the press box, and I ended up sitting in the press box with the current head coach, Jim Curtin, who was an assistant at the time. He went to Villanova, and it was actually great to sit there. The reason why he was in the press box was he was sort of radioing in things that he would see, so just have a higher up vantage point. And it was really good to kind of hear and have a conversation with him about how he was seeing the game. But anyway, to kind of advance this along, my next step with Philadelphia was to try to become compensated, and also be more influential, not just like kind of help plan for the next opponent, but maybe to be part of the conversation and how the budget, how the roster is managed, and assessing the players and the team. But the same guy who I told you about, who was working in the league office, ended up getting offered the GM job at Toronto. And so he asked me if I wanted to be the assistant GM. And I said, that's not an option for me. I want to stay here. I enjoy being a professor. I got my family settled here in Philadelphia. Why don't, if you're interested in analytics and me being part of that, why don't we just sort of create a consulting type position? So that was the start of 2014. So I've been with Toronto since then. And just a little history about Toronto FC. They were up to date there, so this is 2014. They were an expansion club in 2007. They were a perennial loser every year. There was so much hype. A great city. You've been to Toronto before. It's a great sports city. Fantastic stadium, soccer-specific facility, right on the outskirts of the city on the Gardner Expressway. You can see it right when you're coming in. But they made bad decision after bad decision. Never were settled with the coach. Weren't settled with the front office. Had the most turnover in player personnel in the league. So finally, a very aggressive, so the CEO of Maple Leaf Sports at the time was a guy by the name of Tim Turkey, who was formerly with LA, the Lakers and the Galaxy's operating group. He was with them, but he was actually very influential in bringing David Beckham to the league. He's just, he's now helping David Beckham with his expansion with Miami. It hasn't been going too well, but he was just very aggressive in his approach with the club. He was very ambitious. He wanted to hire the best talent, and he didn't mind it being a young, bold decision, so that's why he wanted to hire my friend, and he convinced the owners to spend more money, and it was a big turnaround, and you can't get away with just spending money in Major League Soccer because there's a cap. If you're going to spend money, it's only going to be on 3 players, the designated players who have a maximum charging cap, but you can pay unlimited money. So he was able to convince ownership to pay, $6.5 million to sign Michael Bradley. At the time, $6.5 million to sign Jermaine Defoe, who was a star striker from the Premier League. Signed a Brazilian for $2 million. After a couple of years, it became Josie Altidore, who's now on the team. Some of you guys who are soccer fans probably aren't happy with those 2 names right now. World Cup failure. But you also had to, where I'm going with this is that it's not just about those players, it's also about the rest of the roster. And, you kind of have to think like a pie chart, all right? So, we have a limited number of international players, so you got to spin well and be smart about who you recruit there. You got to have homegrown players up through your academy that are going to be productive. You got to draft well. And so, the GM, with his inside knowledge of how the league works and, the ability to have relationships with agents and be smart with the cap and, use innovative methods to evaluate players, assess the team. The club made the playoffs for the first time in 2015. That was the second season of this. 2016, which was last year, made the playoffs again, got all the way to the MLS Cup, lost in a shootout. We played 120 minutes of scoreless soccer. It was against the Seattle Sounders. It was in Toronto. It was below freezing. Seattle did not have a shot on goal the entire game. We got unlucky. Capri made a couple of great saves. We go to a shootout. We lose by one kick. That's just the way sports works. We miss out on the championship. But this year, 2017, we first of all, won the Canadian Championship. There's a Canadian Cup and won that. Won the regular season. Also set the points record historically, most points ever in the regular season. We're still alive in the playoffs. We just advanced past Red Bulls. We're now in the conference championship against Columbus. If you follow that story, they're in jeopardy of losing their franchise to Austin. So they've got a whole thing that they're playing for. But we're hopefully on track to have another shot at that MLS Cup. So it's nice that this project that I've been involved in has been. You never know. You want to trust the process, right? But ultimately, you're hoping for the outcomes, and the outcomes have been great. And so it's just been something that I've been able to. A couple of you have had me for class. Depending on which class you have me, if it's a sports analytics class, I've been able to bring those examples from the consulting in there. So I feel like that experience has sort of helped bring real life examples into the classroom, and then kind of vice versa, some of the techniques that I picked up on being a researcher, teacher, also applying to that position. So yeah, that brings me here, and it's obviously something that very, very happy, pleased with how it's going.
How do you balance Villanova and this gig in terms of percentages of time? Is it different times a year?
Yeah, I'll tell you. It's tough at times to strike that balance. But in the first year, that I was involved in this position, it was just me. It was a one-man show when it came to analytics. And with the club that in the first part of that year, so the GM inherited a coaching staff that was abrasive with this approach. So really, I was just sort of like kind of doing these small projects for the front office. Then come September, which kind of coincided with the start of the next academic year, the coaching staff, former one got fired. We replaced it with a guy who was our academy director, who was sort of handpicked to eventually be a successor. But this new staff was very hungry for information and embraced it. So. Right off the start, the first game I did, so I hadn't done an opposition scout for the entire season. Then all of a sudden, it's like hours after the decision was made, this was on a Sunday, they actually played the Union here on a Wednesday that year, and the coaching staff wanted a full report on the Union, by Wednesday, and I was like, a couple of weeks into the semester. So that was a crazy fall because I was just doing everything that the coaches wanted, that the front office wanted. I knew that probably that was not that way was not sustainable, and so a big thing kind of after that season, going into the next year, was to hire someone full time to kind of take on this responsibility of kind of the quick questions, the day-to-day kind of grind that needed to happen. Because I think ultimately there needed to be someone on site to have that face time. So I hired. Fortunately, we hired well. I found a guy who's great. He is has a computer science background, but he was working with the leading data provider. So he knew the ins and outs of like what to look for in this data, how it was captured. He also is a pretty decent communicator. He's got a little bit of a playing background, so he ticked a lot of the boxes. And so since that happened, now it's a better balance because I can really set set my time. I'm not forced to do anything so I will kind of create projects, I'll oversee him, and I have a regular stream of reporting that I do, but usually I can kind of manage my time to put it in. So where I was traveling maybe 1 to 2 times a month in the first year, now I travel just like every other month. Roughly I do 8 maximum trips is in my contract to Toronto, and I'm usually doing that, trying to find breaks in the Villanova schedule to make those trips. And then here and there trying to get to games. I try to prioritize. I've obviously blocked out December 9th, and not to jinx it, but that's when the MLS Cup final is. And there are a few games I'll try to get to in Toronto, but the nice thing is that there's Philadelphia, New York's, I can drive to some road games. So the travel isn't as burdensome as it was initially. So that takes a load off. Yeah. Do you guys have any questions? Yeah.
Jack.
I do actually.
Sure.
I read an article about Theo Epstein. He was talking about kind of the evolution of analytics in baseball. And he said at first, like when Moneyball came out, it was a huge advantage for small market teams. He's like, now it's pretty much just a prerequisite for every organization to have a very advanced analytics team. So, like, where do you kind of see analytics going and growing into like what certain directions for all sports? Really?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's sort of where analytics could really be a differentiator back then because not as many teams were doing it. Now it's becoming more of like a qualifier. This is what you should be doing. I always say though that it ultimately, just having a department, just establishing that alone can't do it. I mean, obviously you gotta build the right models, come up with the right metrics, get good information from it, and actually make the right decisions. So having everything come together is a challenge. So I think there's plenty of organizations that, great departments, that at the end of the day, they're not putting it all together. So I think that my point there is that even though there's a lot of teams that are in it, you're still going to be able to set yourself apart if it can all come together in the right way, and for each organization to understand specifically what is the role there, but there has to be some role, and you have to be, because I think that you want to be producing good information, and why not have all the information that you can that would be relevant for making a decision. So, baseball, obviously they're at a point where most teams have department. We see what's going on with the Phillies right now. They a couple years ago they really started internally built their department. Now they're making sure that they have a manager that is going to actually bring that into his decision making during games. So they're fully on board with that. And you can go around the league. I mean, Houston Astros are a great example of a team that went all in 3 years ago. ESPN had in the magazine, I think 2 or 3 years ago, they did rankings, and it's really interesting when you look back at that now. If you look at the Sixers, the Houston Astros, you look at some of the teams in the top 10 of across the sports, like the most invested in analytics, and then you look at their teams, 3-4 years after that, and more often than not, you're seeing winners that are there. And the Astros were obviously a great success story. Now, and just to bring this around, so soccer's always been a bit slower, and I think that it's a number of reasons. When you compare the sports, baseball is by nature so statistically driven. You can isolate the game, so we can say, okay, here's a pitcher versus batter. You got the fielders, it's sort of discrete events that are going on in that game. You can always say that, okay, here's the state space. We got, here's the count. It's 3-2 count. It's 1 out. Runners on first and second, and it's difficult. In football, you can go play by play and think about yards to go and where on the field, and you can classify as pass play, run play. But soccer's so fluid, and it's very complex analytically to break it down at times. And then, so often you dominate a game, and because it's so difficult to finally score a goal, we start to get into the stats, you lose faith because, who says possession is important? Because, we had 70% possession this one game, and then we lost 1-0, and then the next game we had 30 and we won, so that tells you about possession. First of all, deciphering through all the variables and understanding what's meaningful, that's a challenge. But there, like any sport, you also have that sort of that traditional mindset of, you know, you have to be around the game and understand the ins and outs, and that you're not going to be able to necessarily just break it down numbers and get to the point. I think that there's some balance there that, yes, you have to understand the game, but understand the role of what the data can tell you. And I find the biggest buy-in in soccer, it's a game that we can all agree there's a lot of running that takes place in soccer. So there's not many coaches that are left that are going to tell you that, like, sports science and, you know, athlete monitoring is not going to be an important part of the plan, because they know that, you know, especially MLS with all the travel and, you know, the number of games, and then you got players who have international commitments, that obviously, you know, sessions need to be well planned in terms of how hard the players are working, and that if we can do anything to reduce injuries, even if it's like a 5-10% reduction, that can make all the difference, because that's, you know, 1 or 2 players we have healthy in a big game. So that's an easy buy-in. It's tough when you start to get into metrics and trying to say, like, you know, this player is more valuable than the other, because it's a puzzle that you're fitting to ultimately. But you know, it comes around to just, I think, establishing the role. You know, what is the role and what metrics can we sort of agree are, you know, based on the data we have, are good, and others that we should have less, you know, belief in. And I think there's a lot of, you know, combining the subjective and the objective to ultimately come up with a decision. So it's just, every sport is going to, I think the way it's implemented is going to be a bit different. You're starting to see it in football, you know, now that they have the RFID technology, and that you're getting tracking and player movements. It's going to unlock some potential. You know, certainly teams have been able to leverage the play-by-play data to understand tendencies pretty well, and I think that more and more coaches are receptive to that, you know, and open to get those breakdowns in their preparation. But it's not going to, it's going to eventually get to a steady state, and before it goes on decline and phases out. And I don't think there's going to be a day when all of a sudden departments contracting and you know, just dissipating to nothing, because where technology is and data, you know, it's going to be around. So it's a long-winded answer, but it's a deep one.
When you do when you do like they say, do an advance on the union, when that tore up your week.
Yeah.
Just can you give us an idea of what that means? Like,
Sure.
What's their best lineup on the field? What's their spacing? Who should we?
I think first of all, the best way to do this, and I think this is sort of in the class of you know, it's opposition scouting. I think that's one of the touch points of analytics is, you know, how can you use the performance data to, you know, if it's team tendencies, you know, individual player tendencies, and so my position with the union was a bit more focused on the opposition. It was okay. So we're, you know, they're playing New York Red Bulls, and so, you know, when they're successful, what tends to happen? When they're not successful, what tends to happen? Who are the players that tend to stand out? So, you know, some coaches don't want you to make recommendations. They just want you sort of to present the facts that you're observing. John Hackworth, who was the coach at the time, was comfortable with me making recommendations. And so, sort of the recommendations I would make would be kind of like, okay, you need to disrupt the way New York is playing, because when they're doing well, these things are tending to happen. So if you can formulate a game plan around, you know, if they have a tendency to attack down the left side, you know, a lot of their chances created were through a few common players, and obviously those are the players you want to zero. And if I could just present them a fact, like, you know, 90% of the scoring chances are, you know, these 2 players are involved in, that, you know, you could just focus on disrupting that. And at the end, there's so many things I could find when I dig into the data, but if I could summarize it into like 3 to 5 points that are easy to digest, and then to kind of go with next, that's the way to do it. And I think that ultimately the executive summary, that first page of the report, is a very important skill to do. And that's what I learned in that first year, was that, you know, I could have all sorts of things in the report that he could go to, but in an executive summary, you know, knowing that he may not have much time to look at it, I needed to kind of get it right and have like the, you know, three, if he's only going to read one page, read these 3 things and hopefully go with it. Yeah.
The other question I had is, I mean, just definitionally, when I described it to the group before you came in, I sort of said analytics is just getting away from the emotion, the gut feel of how to coach, how to scout, and putting it all in data-driven analytics. You must have a more meaty definition in terms of where you see your role for the team.
Yeah. You know, we have, like myself, I mean, when I have passion for the game, it's hard to completely take the emotion out of it. And I think what's tough too is that you may come in with a hypothesis and you're hoping that's going to be true. But I think ultimately, like you pointed out, I think my role is to present the information in a way where it is removed of that. Like for me, I take the emotion and I motivate that. I use that as motivation to become a better analyst, I guess. And so, but then that information, you know, it's not. Whereas like if you have the traditional scout, it's okay. It's based on watching video, and then you believe that, you know, you believe this player has speed, and that you believe that there is a tendency to dribble, and you believe that the player does not distribute very well. Whereas in my report, if I've got this, you know, if I have the player tracking on it, I can actually give the speed. You know, I can give that velocity. I can, you know, I can give you a percentage on the passes that he makes, and I can, you know, we've derived even a better with the passing. I can list it in those terms, and so yeah, I mean that's my role is to do a good job. But what's also important there is that I've presented. So if I'm going to use any kind of language or metrics, and I picked this up just by Ben Alamar, and he has a good book on. It's a sort of a good high-level approach to manager's guide to sports analytics, and talks about the phases of metric creation and kind of metric implementation and organization. So you can't just, like the analyst just can't just sort of invent some metric and then it surfaces in a report, and then you're asking the coach and the GM to start believing in it. That you ultimately, that key step is the communication, the sort of the presentation of it. So I needed to present these new sort of next-gen type metrics. I had presented to the GM and the coaches. And so in that presentation, I didn't want to just stick to like tables and spreadsheets. I'd put video up. And so what I'd do is I would take the metric and first of all explain it, but then show in the video how the metric comes to life and how, you know, this particular play, this is how the player would be scored on that metric, and this is why. And that way, first of all, it engages the audience because they have a video, and coaches are going to, you know, and it's funny, when we put video up with coaches, then they're going to start going on tangents and talking about, you know, things that are happening in that play, and they'll get into like a side conversation about it. But you know, that was important because then, you know, they enjoyed it. They started to, I mean, they're not going to be 100% convinced after that, but at least they can always draw back on that experience. And then there's still going to be, have to be continual dialogue, because it's very interesting, because coaches, I always like to talk about the coach's role in this, and that when they're winning, they're going to be very happy to come in the room and enjoy the presentation, and they're going to be very cheerful about what you're putting in the report. All of a sudden, when they're losing, there's adversity, and then the report is pointing out problems. All of a sudden, the defense mechanisms go up, and then there's questioning about how good the metrics are, because they may, after watching the game, they believe they should have won, and then when all of a sudden say the metrics point to the fact that they should not have won, then they're in disagreement, and we have to kind of go back to the video and kind of, you know, get back to square one. So it is where I'm going with this, it is an ongoing dialogue that takes place, but I think the collaboration, you know, our club, some clubs will just sort of keep the analytics away from the coaches, but our GM really believes in sort of transparency and everyone being on the same page, and so, you know, he doesn't want his analytics department to be this sort of this you know, entrenched group and not, you know, interacting with others. He wants us to be visible. and for there to be dialogue and for reports to be shared. And I just sent a report earlier today. It was a sports science related report, so I made sure the sports science department was CC'd on it, the GM was CC'd, the executive assistant, a member of the coaching staff, so that we know, the organization knows what's flowing from one department to another, and that information is going to be useful to multiple areas. Yep.
Do you have any advice for us, I imagine we're not mostly math, how to become more analytically literate as far as like sources, or like you mentioned the book, or,
yeah,
certain websites maybe?
It's good. There's, I think, a really good place for content. I mean, there's books, and I think that Ben Alomar, Manager's Guide to Sports Analytics. I mean, once you get on Amazon and start going through that, you're going to pick up on some good ones. And that's good to get a taste and kind of an overview of what's going on. I think that if you're really interested in analytics, going to if you Google MIT sports analytics, ESPN and MIT co-host a conference every year, and on that page they have videos of panel discussions that go on. There's a lot of interesting topics, and certainly gets into the legal area as well, and that will give you a taste of the field. Now the question is, at what level do you want to get involved? Obviously, if you want to be an analyst, then you need to build the quant and the tech skills. But if you're interested more of, okay, you want to get into a sports organization, you aspire to be a GM, that I think it's understanding typically how these analytics departments are structured, and what are some use cases and examples of how they've been successfully implemented and why, because and he would kill me if I was saying this, but the guy's a GM. I told you he's a law grad, and he was an economics major, and he was on campus. This might have been a time I was trying to link the two of you together. I think there's a story. I think I was trying to introduce him. I thought Professor Brandt would be a great person for him to meet, because given his experience in the front office and legal background, that was his last day in Major League Soccer before he took the GM job, and so he was completely hungover. His wife drove him to campus. He was an hour late. He was all apologetic about messing up that meeting, and he ended up hanging out with me in the office, and he was like, and he goes, this is really embarrassing, but can you teach me how to do regression again? I completely forget. So, and I think it's like he's regarded as like the guru, and kind of the Theo Epstein of soccer, but really he doesn't need to know how to do regression to be successful at that. He just needs to hire well, and sort of then understand the information that he's getting. So there's a lot of resources that are out there, but I do recommend, if you're trying to get into the sports industry, more like on an analytics, a great conference to attend, because you're going to have all sorts of people. You're going to have the analysts. You're going to have even just pure sports business people, maybe aspiring executive level types that are there.
Time for one more question. Yes.
Yeah.
You know how much stock U.S. soccer puts into analytics?
Well, you can Google. There's probably a YouTube of Bruce Arena with an analytics rant. He's. It's almost like you listen to that and you wonder if it's like a Bill Belichick type of thing, because he definitely does his research. I mean, he has a staff, very diligently studying the opposition, and he has this guy that was his roommate from college that I think he's like the director of research, and he feeds him information. But then he'll, like in the public space, he'll rip analytics or do something to kind of throw people off. But Bruce Arena is very highly regarded. He was the former coach of this team, and he's just took it upon himself in some press conferences to, if a reporter says, oh, you outshot the opposition, or you won the game 1-0, but you got outshot by the opposition, and you lost possession battle, so do you think you were lucky to win that game? And then he'll take that as an opportunity to then completely bash the entire movement of analytics and its place in soccer. So I know that in probably his game planning and stuff, that it probably wasn't much there, but when Klinsman was the manager, I think he definitely bought in kind of from a sports science standpoint. So I think a lot of staff was in place, and I think the way in which they monitored the athletes, I think they had GPS monitors probably in training, and they probably did more analytics from that standpoint than anything as far as the technical or tactical strategic preparation for the matches. That's a topic that I could talk about, the U.S. failure.
You would talk about it more on the field or off the field? Would be your critique?
Oh yeah, just in terms of like whether it's it boils down to those particular players or it's just a systematic.
Yeah.
thing. Well, I think that certainly this particular team, I think with some of the it sort of lacked a bit of character. The only benefit of the doubt I'll give them is just that it is a bit choppy when you have to play these friendlies,
Right.
It's the MLS season. But I think that you go through a coaching change and then just the fact that the CONCACAF has gotten more competitive. It's not easy to do, but I think that what you're seeing a little bit is sort of this product of maybe if our best players had continued to play in Europe, and they would have continued to grow. But these guys, I think these guys deserve some credit. Now they are getting good paychecks, but they have opted to stay in the country to grow the game, and I think that ultimately in the future, getting the youth development model the right way, building our professional league, that's ultimately going to get us in a position where we don't have these failures and we can be more competitive at the World Cup level. But I think this generation has kind of taken one for the team to an extent, because a lot of these guys, the Michael Bradleys, Josie Altidores, they probably would be better players now if they stayed in Europe, but they opted to come back to the league. They getting attractive offers, but it's probably hindering a bit their ability to go to the next level. And so we're sort of in this odd place right now. We have bright talent. We have the Pulisic's, the 19-year-old who's doing fantastic in the Bundesliga, and he was arguably our best player in the campaign. We got more players like that in the pipeline. It's just going to take a little while to finally see that and have them come together. So it's my just a couple of minutes on that. Yeah.
Do you think the analytics is that heavy on Premier League and overseas soccer as well?
Yeah, Manchester, obviously there's going to be a correlation with money spent and the product in the field, but
Right.
Manchester City, who is having a historically good season right now, they have probably maybe one of the biggest analytics departments in all of soccer. That was actually one of my observations when I had an opportunity before I got involved with the club to go to Manchester for a conference, and I was meeting all these analysts from Premier clubs, and I was sort of surprised that they existed, and it was all, it was the same thing where they were just trying to keep pace with these Premier League owners and front office people were observing what was going on here. They're saying, we got to do that, but figuring that out is another story. But Manchester City, that's another investment they're making, having that large department. They've come up with a brand new facility. They've finally got Pep Guardiola, who's Barcelona's former manager, and they're trying to be a global brand. And they're on the field. They're doing everything to match that. So you've got really good investment, not just in the Premier League, but especially in the Bundesliga. That a lot of clubs are big into that. Germany in their World Cup year 2014, they partnered with SAP. And they did a custom development project where they pulled together all these sources of data. They merged it with video, and they had like smart boards in the locker room, and players could punch in on their on the opposition, and so then the players got spoiled. They went the leading guys in Germany, like the Thomas Müller, went back to Bayern Munich, and it's like, why can't we have what the German Federation did? And that's part of the problem. If you're a partner with SAP, that's like a seven-figure proposition right there, and so it's there's still a little bit of hesitancy to invest. That's probably the wealthiest federation that's out there, but the Man Cities, the people that have money are spending, and they're seeing good returns from it. Yeah. Yes?
When you're doing your reports, like for Toronto, do you do it more of like team holistically, or do you go down to the player where like this defender will not be good against this like forward matchup wise, so you should switch them, or?
Talking about the opposition scouts, it's a combination of both. So the current state of our opposition scout, so the blueprint was a collaborative effort with the coaching staff. So they wanted to see certain things, but then we also presented to them some ideas. So it was sort of a back and forth to get that, and there's a lot of also improvements along the way. But basically, sometimes even ahead of games. And so very timely, the coaching staff will get a very detailed report. I mean, it has that cover page, but it's broken down. There's graphics, visualizations that represent team style and tendencies, and then it sort of breaks down into the key players. And if it's a special player, it sort of puts it in the context of the league and where that player ranks. Most of the time, it's stuff that the coaches probably already know, especially when you're getting late in the season. It's no secret what these teams are at that point. But there might always be a little nugget here and there that maybe it's a formation change or something that, because we'll always have a bit more detail in the last 3 games. So we sort of have a season perspective within the last 3 games, because there could be something that is going on in the last 3 games that may be foretelling for the next. So it is a combination of both types. Yeah, well, there's always some course. Some of you guys cross over a bit to do some courses in the business school. I'm involved in the MBA program, and there's an analytics and sports class that Professor Brandt has been generous with his time in the past to come guest speak. I do that once or twice a year. I'm also involved. We have a Master's of Science in Analytics, an online program, so I teach courses there. So they could range from anywhere from operations courses to pure analytics to sports analytics is sort of the area that I get into. So maybe I'll see some of you guys maybe in that area, but if not, I can continue to be like a reference, or if you want to have a further conversation on this, I'd be happy to right across campus. So pleasure to come here this afternoon. Nice change of pace for Wednesday.
Great to have you. Let's give him a warm welcome.